Jean-Jacques Rousseau remains one of the most influential philosophers ever to write about human nature because he tells a story that almost everyone wants to believe. Unlike Hobbes, who begins with fear and conflict, Rousseau begins with innocence. According to him, human beings are not born corrupt, violent, or selfish. They become that way through society. Civilization does not merely organize people. It deforms them. The closer we move toward wealth, status, competition, and artificial social hierarchies, the further we move from our original nature. It is an extraordinarily powerful idea. Whenever modern life feels overwhelming, Rousseau seems to offer an explanation. If people feel anxious, perhaps society is making them anxious. If communities feel divided, perhaps civilization has corrupted natural human relationships. If individuals feel alienated, perhaps the problem is not human nature at all, but the institutions we have built around it. This is why Rousseau continues attracting readers centuries later. His philosophy speaks directly to a modern longing. Many people already suspect that something has gone wrong with civilization. Technology connects us, but leaves us lonely. Wealth grows while satisfaction often declines. Competition consumes more and more of life. Success increasingly depends on comparison rather than contentment. Rousseau appears to diagnose all of this before the modern world even existed. At first, his argument feels remarkably persuasive. He observes that many human desires are not natural at all. People do not simply seek food, shelter, or companionship. They seek recognition. They compare themselves constantly. They become obsessed with reputation, status, prestige, and the opinions of strangers. A person may possess everything necessary for survival and still remain miserable because someone else possesses more. Rousseau calls attention to something psychologically profound. Human suffering often comes less from absolute deprivation than from comparison. A person living comfortably may suddenly feel poor after seeing someone wealthier. Someone admired by friends may feel insignificant after encountering greater fame. Satisfaction becomes unstable because it depends on relative position rather than genuine need. Modern psychology strongly supports this insight. Research repeatedly shows that people evaluate themselves comparatively rather than absolutely. Social comparison shapes happiness, confidence, ambition, and even personal identity. On this point, Rousseau was remarkably ahead of his time. He also understood that societies can manufacture desires that never previously existed. Luxury creates new standards. Fashion creates new insecurities. Prestige creates endless competition. Entire industries survive by convincing people they are incomplete without products, experiences, or achievements they never previously considered necessary. These observations remain deeply relevant. But this is also where Rousseau begins making a much larger claim. He gradually moves from criticizing civilization to idealizing what came before it. The natural human being becomes peaceful, independent, compassionate, and psychologically healthy. Corruption arrives only after property, inequality, social hierarchy, and organized civilization reshape human relationships. This is where many readers stop questioning him, because the story feels emotionally satisfying. If society is responsible for our problems, then somewhere beneath the corruption there exists a purer self waiting to be recovered. The solution becomes not merely political reform, but psychological return. Strip away artificial pressures, and authentic humanity will naturally reappear. It is a beautiful vision. The problem is that history provides very little evidence that such a world ever existed. There is no clear historical period where human beings lived in lasting harmony before civilization introduced greed and conflict. Archaeology paints a far more complicated picture. Early human societies experienced cooperation, certainly, but they also experienced violence, tribal warfare, scarcity, domination, and competition. Compassion existed alongside brutality, not before it. Human nature appears mixed from the beginning. People cooperate because cooperation helps them survive. They also compete because resources are limited. They care for family. They distrust outsiders. They sacrifice. They betray. These tendencies emerge throughout history, regardless of whether societies are technologically advanced or relatively simple. That creates a serious challenge for Rousseau's central narrative. He often writes as though civilization invented corruption. But perhaps civilization merely magnified tendencies that were already present. Perhaps wealth intensifies envy rather than creating it. Perhaps institutions amplify ambition rather than inventing ambition. Perhaps social comparison becomes more visible in complex societies without being entirely absent from simpler ones. If that is true, then Rousseau's philosophy rests on a romantic image of humanity that says more about what we wish were true than about what human beings have actually been. And once that possibility enters the discussion, his entire account of human nature begins to look far more idealized than historical reality seems willing to support. The deeper problem with Rousseau appears when his criticism of civilization slowly turns into a criticism of human progress itself. At first, his argument feels balanced. He is not denying that societies produce knowledge, technology, law, and culture. He is asking whether these achievements have actually made human beings happier, freer, or morally better. That is an important question. Material progress and human flourishing are not automatically the same thing. A society can become wealthier while its people become lonelier. Technology can solve practical problems while creating psychological ones. Economic growth can increase comfort without increasing meaning. Rousseau deserves enormous credit for recognizing that progress should not be measured only by what we build, but by what kind of people we become. This insight remains surprisingly modern. Today, many people live with comforts unimaginable only a century ago. Yet anxiety, loneliness, depression, and social fragmentation remain widespread. Rousseau anticipated the possibility that civilization could become externally successful while internally dissatisfied. But then he takes one step further. Instead of saying civilization creates new problems, he begins implying that civilization itself is the problem. That distinction matters enormously, because once civilization becomes the source of corruption, the natural state starts looking morally superior almost by definition. Simplicity becomes purity. Complexity becomes corruption. The farther humanity moves from nature, the farther it supposedly moves from authenticity. This is where Rousseau's philosophy begins replacing analysis with nostalgia. Not nostalgia for a specific historical period, but for an imagined condition of humanity that cannot actually be observed. The noble human being exists largely as a philosophical reconstruction rather than a historical reality. Rousseau asks us to imagine what people would have been before inequality, property, organized society, and social comparison reshaped their psychology. The difficulty is that no one has ever encountered this purely natural human being. Every human being we know has always existed within relationships, families, traditions, language, and culture. Even the earliest archaeological evidence reveals cooperation mixed with conflict, care mixed with violence, generosity mixed with competition. There is no clear point where humanity was simply innocent. This creates a serious methodological problem. Rousseau criticizes civilization by comparing it to a version of human nature that history cannot confirm. The comparison feels persuasive because the imagined alternative is impossible to falsify. Whenever civilization appears cruel, the natural human being looks kinder by contrast. Whenever modern life appears alienating, nature appears peaceful. But appearance is not evidence. In fact, anthropological research suggests something far more complicated. Small-scale societies often display extraordinary cooperation within their own groups, while simultaneously engaging in intense conflict with outsiders. Tribal loyalty and tribal hostility frequently develop together. Human beings evolved both capacities at the same time. That complexity sits uneasily inside Rousseau's framework. He often treats compassion as humanity's original instinct and competition as civilization's invention. Yet, both seem deeply rooted in our evolutionary history. We are capable of remarkable empathy, but usually within circles we identify as our own. We are also capable of exclusion, rivalry, and violence long before modern institutions enter the picture. Human nature is not naturally peaceful or naturally violent. It contains both possibilities from the beginning. This makes Rousseau's optimism feel incomplete. He correctly identifies the destructive effects of status competition. He correctly observes that societies amplify vanity, comparison, and inequality. But amplification is not the same as creation. Civilization may magnify tendencies that already existed instead of inventing them from nothing. There's another difficulty hidden inside his account of inequality. Rousseau argues that private property transforms relationships by creating hierarchy, dependence, and domination. Wealth allows some people to command others. Recognition becomes uneven. Social life becomes organized around comparison rather than simple coexistence. Again, there is truth here. Economic inequality can distort political power. Status competition can poison relationships. Entire cultures can become obsessed with prestige rather than character. Rousseau sees these dangers with remarkable clarity. But property also makes long-term civilization possible. Stable ownership encourages investment, planning, agriculture, innovation, and institutions capable of surviving across generations. The same structures Rousseau criticizes also make education, medicine, science, and cultural development possible on a scale unknown in purely tribal life. His philosophy often emphasizes the costs while underestimating the achievements. That imbalance becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Because every solution Rousseau hints at seems to require recovering a simplicity that complex societies cannot realistically return to. Humanity cannot unknow agriculture, cities, technology, writing, law, or global interdependence. The path backward exists largely as philosophical imagination rather than practical possibility. And that reveals the deeper tension inside Rousseau's vision. He brilliantly diagnoses many illnesses of modern civilization. But the healthier world he points toward is less a historical reality than a moral ideal, one that inspires reflection, but becomes much harder to defend once history, anthropology, and human psychology are taken seriously. The final weakness in Rousseau's philosophy is that it encourages people to believe that the deepest problems of human life come primarily from society rather than from humanity itself. That belief is deeply attractive because it offers hope. If civilization created our corruption, then perhaps changing civilization can restore our innocence. The solution appears straightforward. Reform institutions, reduce inequality, weaken artificial hierarchies, and the authentic human being will finally emerge. It is a beautiful vision, but it asks history to support something history never actually shows. No matter how far back we look, human beings are never simply innocent creatures corrupted by progress. They cooperate, but they also compete. They nurture, but they also dominate. They build communities, but they also divide themselves into tribes. Compassion and aggression appear together from the earliest evidence we possess. This is what makes Rousseau so fascinating. He identifies a genuine source of human suffering while drawing the wrong conclusion about its origin. There is little doubt that civilization magnifies comparison. Modern societies expose people to endless standards of beauty, success, wealth, and recognition. A person no longer compares themselves to a small village. They compare themselves to millions of strangers every day. Rousseau saw this danger long before social media, global advertising, and digital culture made it impossible to escape. On this point, he was astonishingly perceptive. But comparison did not begin with civilization. Civilization expanded it. Human beings compared themselves long before cities existed. Tribal societies had status, prestige, influence, and competition. Families compared siblings. Communities rewarded courage, skill, attractiveness, and leadership. The forms changed, but the psychological tendency remained remarkably familiar. Rousseau mistakes amplification for creation. That distinction changes everything. If civilization merely intensifies traits already present in human nature, then abolishing certain institutions will never remove those traits completely. Envy does not disappear because inequality is reduced. Ambition does not vanish because wealth is redistributed. The desire for recognition simply finds new objects. History repeatedly illustrates this pattern. Even movements founded on equality often develop new hierarchies. Prestige shifts from wealth to ideology, from ancestry to education, from property to moral status. Human beings continue competing because the desire for recognition runs much deeper than any single economic system. Rousseau underestimates this extraordinary adaptability. He often treats social structures as though they generate the human motivations operating within them. But many structures survive precisely because they express motivations that already exist. Institutions shape people, certainly. Yet people also shape institutions. The relationship moves in both directions. There's another irony hidden inside Rousseau's philosophy. He criticizes civilization for making people dependent on the opinions of others. Yet his own solution often depends upon imagining a more authentic self hidden beneath society. But where would this authentic self come from? Every language we speak comes from others. Every value we inherit comes from others. Every moral concept develops through relationships with others. Even our ability to think depends upon cultures that existed before we were born. There is no isolated human self waiting beneath society like an untouched original. Human identity is formed through interaction from the very beginning. Society does not merely corrupt us, it also creates us. Without it, there would be no language, no philosophy, no science, no art, no law, and perhaps no coherent sense of self at all. This is where Rousseau's distinction between nature and civilization becomes too simple. He treats nature as authenticity and society as corruption. Reality is more complicated. Society corrupts. Society also educates. Society oppresses. Society also liberates. Society creates inequality. Society also creates medicine, literature, justice, universities, music, and the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. The same civilization capable of producing greed is also capable of producing compassion on a scale impossible for isolated individuals. It builds hospitals for strangers, protects rights through institutions, preserves knowledge across centuries, and allows millions of people who will never meet to cooperate peacefully. Rousseau saw the costs of civilization with remarkable clarity. He did not always appreciate its achievements with equal clarity. That is why his philosophy continues to resonate emotionally. Almost everyone has moments when modern life feels artificial, exhausting, and disconnected from what matters most. Rousseau gives voice to that feeling more powerfully than almost any other philosopher. He reminds us that progress should never be measured only by wealth or technology. Human flourishing matters just as much. That lesson remains invaluable. But his deeper conclusion is much harder to accept. Humanity was never simply good until civilization made it bad. Human beings carried both compassion and conflict from the very beginning. Civilization did not invent our contradictions. It inherited them. It amplified some. It restrained others. And it gave us the tools to struggle against the worst parts of ourselves while strengthening the best. That is why Rousseau's philosophy feels simultaneously inspiring and deeply misleading. He understood that society changes human nature, but he romanticized a world where human nature itself was supposedly